big lies contain a grain of truth. So the grain of truth in the renewable lie is that the variable inputs into renewable facilities, sun and wind, are free, but that hides the lie. And, you know, the very simple analogy would be offering somebody a car powered by intermittent renewables. It would perform perfectly while the weather conditions were cooperating, but for the 60 to 70% of the time the weather wasn't, you'd need another car. And so the idea that renewables are cheap is a fiction. The other point I would make to people like Chris Bowen is that if renewables are genuinely cheaper, remove the mandates that require energy retailers to purchase renewable credits and remove all of the subsidies. In economic terms, for the consumer, renewables are poor because they don't provide power on demand. So you've got to backfill a whole system to achieve that. Whereas if you have a nuclear or coal or gas-fired facility, you can switch it on and off. But secondly, from the point of view of renewable developers, you've got massive fixed cost investments in wind and solar facilities that produce intermittent market revenues, sometimes a lot, sometimes none, most of the time none. And so that's why they need the subsidies. So the graph you just showed before shows almost a one-to-one relationship between proportion of electricity obtained from renewables and cost of electricity. It's almost a one-to-one relationship. There's no jurisdiction in the world that has gone further than us with renewable penetration and seen costs lower. Now, farmers who are bearing the brunt of all these new facilities and low-income people who are flocking to One Nation and other parties are the canaries in the coal mine. The insulated people, the secretaries of the Treasury and other departments earning $1 million a year, the people in education institutions, the people in teal electorates, they're insulated because they're rich and they're protected. Again, I go back to the pandemic as a kind of microcosm of all of that, where you had insulated people applauding lockdowns and work from home directives, and then everybody that worked with their hands or on their feet were wiped out from their employment and basically had to start again. So just one more thing on trust, John. I didn't touch on this before. It's not just the absence of trade-offs, which I totally agree with you. It's not permitting people to question.
Yeah.
I think that's what really has resulted in the rage, which is finding expression now. Because if you asked a reasonable question, what's a biological woman? Can a man really become a woman? Is Australia really that bad a country? Haven't we always treated Aboriginals with respect? Haven't we got less serious racial divisions than in the US? Can you really save the planet when you only produce 1% of global GDP and China and India are not doing it? You couldn't even ask those questions in Australia until very recently. You were howled down. Even in government, in Treasury, I remember sending an email to Martin Parkinson and some senior people when I was a Treasury representative in the US, when the climate change hysteria started. And I said, look, as economists, we can't model an economy beyond 6 months. Our forecasts are always wrong. So why are we attaching so much significance to climate modelling 50 to 100 years ahead? Now, I wasn't a climate skeptic then. I wasn't a denier. I was just an economist and a policy advisor questioning the ability of modelling to predict the far-off future. But I could see that I'd crossed a line, and I was probably seen as not cooperating with the leadership of the department. And that sends a very strong signal to everybody else. So you've got a lot of ambitious public servants, and they hear the secretary talking about cheap renewables, and right down to the graduate level, nobody utters it. When I was in Treasury in 2023, people would come into my office, they'd close the door and we'd have whispered conversations as if we were being disloyal, but we were just talking about costs and trade-offs. So that's the really sad state of our institutions, but it's not permitting people to ask reasonable questions and telling them they're ignorant, which I think's really got up people's goat.